I do see one question already. I do see one question already, is that if there's OPN representation in our audience, and I do see Joe Tercey is on the call, I think.
Yeah, and Susan Barsax is here too.
And Susan as well. Great. Thank you both for being here, as they were the facilitators of our task force and the assessors of our buildings through this process. So they are here as well to help answer questions. Okay. Thank you so much for that question. Okay, so just a brief overview. We hope to spend about 25 to 30 minutes here with you, reviewing some of this content, and then really giving time for questions and answers around these concepts that we are going to present today. Some of you may have already seen our board meeting that happened last week, and that session was also, as all of our board meetings are, as recorded and on our website. And then we also have a landing page for our facility master plan work on our website you can gather a lot more information even than what we present today. So we do again welcome you, and I introduced John, and thank you OPN for also being here, Susan and Joe Tercey. And we just want to do kind of a high level purpose and vision of what started and launched this work, and also our district's vision of why we even initiated some of this work several years ago. And then the task force that met over the last 10 months plus certainly had some pretty clear outcomes in the end of a lot of heavy lifting work, but there were some processes we used along the way, and we'll discuss what those look like. And then what today's discussion is around our facility master plan work is this work has been focused on our secondary schools right now. So this past 10 months, we focused on our secondary schools. Years prior, we had a plan for our elementary facility master plan work, but we knew that we would need to come back to our secondary schools. And so the concepts we present today is around our secondary landscapes. We will talk about finance and the buckets of school finance and what all that looks like, and also impact that this particular facility work, what that ask could look like to our community. And then also just wanted you to be aware that we will continue to have more community sessions. This discussion will continue throughout the fall. We'll be bringing it back to the board in October for a work session. And then going into the winter, we'll have some decisions about how to move forward for a potential vote in March. So that's the big picture of everything. And then we'll wrap up, of course, with getting any questions and answers from you all. So for those of you who don't know, our vision as a school district is every learner future ready. And by every learner, we mean each and every child in our district. And future ready means making sure that they're prepared for the next steps along their journey. So that means kindergartners prepared for first grade all the way through, our graduates being prepared for the workforce, for college and post-secondary education opportunities for them, and that hopefully our kids choose our community as their future, and economic development too is part of future readiness, and what we see as a school district is our connections to the community. This work as a facility master plan task force really focused on the continual assessment of the condition of our facilities, our enrollment, and our population. And that work will always have to continue as we monitor the changes and development of growth of our community, as well as our enrollment. And those of you who are not familiar with all of our buildings, we have 31 brick and mortar sites, and 30 of those are K through 12 environments. We did open an early learning center this year. That was Truman Elementary. It was repurposed into an early learning center. And then of course we have our district office here at the ELSC, but our buildings age from well over 100 years old to Maple Grove just opened its doors, last week. And so we definitely have the full continuum of age of buildings, which of course comes with constant assessment. And so the work of the Facility Master Plan Task Force is really not just to assess the current state, but projected future needs of our students, our district, our community, and of course, the economic development of the greater Cedar Rapids area. We do recognize that our district touches every footprint of the geography of our community. So when we looked at the work of the Facility Master Plan Task Force, and I would invite either Susan or Joe, feel free to jump in here at any time. We knew that we could not do this, the assessments of our buildings alone. We knew that we had to think big picture, and we knew that we were going to have to get some expertise involved to really think about the assessment of our secondary buildings and get the input from our community and our staff members and parents and families. So just a little history lesson here. In 2018, our board adopted a facility master plan that was 2 years worth of work of a task force. And that task force looked at all of our buildings throughout our entire district and zoomed in on the unevenness and the pressing needs at the elementary level. And so the scope of that work was a 20-year plan that was adopted that would take us from 21 elementary schools to approximately 13 elementary schools that were more equitable in size, more equitable in access, to not only provide great opportunities for our students, but also to be able to continually staff and assess the needs of our district. So the task force at the time, although focused on elementary schools, knew a few years down the road we would have to focus on secondary schools. Hence this task force getting back together and studying the work. So we enlisted an RFP process last fall and asked for bids for a team to help assess our buildings and lead this work. OPN happened to be the only firm that participated in that RFP process, and of course then got the bid and helped us through this process over the past year. So part of the input process for this task force was first to start with some listening sessions, and the team went out to all the secondary buildings, listened to students, listened to staff of what their thoughts were around the secondary facilities and pressing needs. And then in addition to that, doing an assessment with leaders as well as with staff members on what are the educational needs, not just the physical needs of a building, but what are the educational needs, current state and projected future state of best practices in education. Then the task force work was really to take that data as well as other data. So gather data by touring some of our secondary facilities and really digging in and seeing the condition of those facilities, survey work, and then also reviewing a lot of different concepts of what's best practice, what's out there in regards to secondary facilities and modernized learning settings, and then a lot of data around our population, around our demographics, as well as around our enrollment trends. And just a ton of discussion that happened over a 10-month time period. We met about every 2 weeks. It was a lot of work and a lot of commitment in order to build some consensus around some driving factors. And then we'll share here what some of those driving factors became as the more we studied the current state of our district and the future needs, not just 10 years down the road, not just 20 years down the road, but what do we project in the next even potentially 40, 50, 60 years? Not to share too much here, but I'm a graduate of Jefferson High School, and I can't believe that my 35th reunion is coming upon me. And so 35 to 40 years can go pretty quickly in a system. And so making sure that we're doing those future projections. And now here we are, we're at the community process where we're gathering input. So the task force has landed on some concepts, shared those just over a week ago with the board. We've gone to some staff sessions. We're getting these community input sessions to hear what are your thoughts on these concepts, on these ideas around our secondary facilities, and press on us, ask hard questions, or your wonders and curiosities and your affirmations of things that's like, oh, that makes sense. So your feedback is really important to us. And then we'll drive that information back to our school board. including financial analysis of our current state, which we'll share today. So the task force planning work focused on sustainability, enrollment, the geographic location of our buildings and what the geography looks like throughout our entire district. And then, of course, again, what does a long-term vision look like? There were lots of considerations that were taken into play here when we looked at what all the possibilities were, including some other districts that are comparable to our size, 4A high schools, districts, I would say. They've built brand new high schools. And so that was even a topic of conversation, is do we look at changing the size of our high schools, reducing the size of our high schools? And quickly, as we looked at our assessment process, the task force settled on some driving factors that were not only taking into consideration the current state, but the future state of our district. Also considered a lot of our historic buildings, renovations and additions versus new buildings. And then also looked at what would be the possibilities of new buildings as well. So lots of different information was considered, and again, lots of different meetings to discuss those things. There's really good questions about how to access the assessments and what was considered. If you go to our website online, that is our facility master plan website, you'll see all the agendas and PowerPoints from the task force, including a lot of data and what were the results of the physical assessments of the facilities and costs for upgrades of the current state, as well as our population studies. So I hope that's helpful. Next slide, please, John. So this is where the task force settled on, and it took us a while to get to this place of what were some of the things that could continue to drive our work forward after we did a lot of study of those assessments and all of that data. It was pretty clear that the recommendation was to maintain our current high school structure, and that being 3 comprehensive high schools and 1 alternative high school. So not a consideration of reducing the number of high schools or adding the number of high schools, but really maintaining that current structure. But one of the big questions is the equity across our system, especially in regards to population size in those 3 high schools. Secondly, as we assess the data, both facilities as well as enrollment and population, recommendation is to reduce the number of middle schools that we have. In our current state, we currently have 6 middle schools, and what would a reduction look like? And then also a very strong recommendation to consider a direct feeder system. Of our 6 middle schools, only 2 are direct feeders to high schools. Currently, McKinley is a direct feeder to Washington High School and only to Washington, and Wilson is a direct feeder to Jefferson. All of the other middle schools split in more than one direction, at least to 2 high schools. Kennedy does not have a direct feeder at all. Kennedy feeds from 4 different middle schools at the current state. Another driving factor was just equity, equity, equity. Equity for our students to have access to great facilities, to great learning spaces, but also that the facilities themselves are equitable across our system. And that as we looked at the pools in each one of the 3 high schools, which have been great access for us for our students in our swimming programs, to upgrade those pools was definitely a heavy price tag. And so we started asking a different set of questions about what if there wasn't renovations to those pools, but a centralized pool for all of our buildings to access, similar to what we do with Kingston Stadium. And so for cost efficiency purposes, as well as for upgrade purposes, as well as for improvements for both swimmers as well as spectators, and on the opportunity for some hosting events that we can't host now, that became a really big conversation. And so a return on investment, but also cost efficiency. So that became a pretty big conversation, because the spaces that those pools take place right now in the high school could also then be repurposed. And there's a lot of square footage in there, and the high schools could really use some more multi-purpose space. And then finally, it's necessary that all of our buildings at the middle and high school have improvements. So we landed on some concepts, and these concepts would take place over a 7 to 10 year timeline, depending on the initiation of where we start, and then of course how long it would take between the projects. So if you look at these thoughts, they are a blend of those considerations we had, but also center on those driving factors that I just shared on the previous slide. So this blend of new versus renovation. So the first thought would be, because of the growth in our district, we see growth on the north side of our town, and up in the Hiawatha and Palo areas. Those are part of our district. And there's also growth out in the west side near the Highway 100 Stony Point area. Because of the growth on the north side, and also the current state of the population inside Kennedy, and I'll just use Harding Middle School as an example, so there'd be a great opportunity to build a new middle school on the north side, probably in the Hiawatha area, that would be for the size of 1,200 students. Just to give you perspective, Harding currently has about 730 students in it. It's a very large middle school for us, with over 700 kids. This would be a building that would be designed for small families or pods for grade levels. So although it fits 1,200 students, we would retrofit it so it felt like smaller schools within a school, which is what the current and best practices are for school design. But that 1,200 student population would then be a direct feeder to Kennedy High School. Secondly, consideration would be, when we look at our high school boundary lines, the current population of Kennedy High School is over 1,800 students. Jefferson is just over 1,600 students, although they have their largest freshman class they've had in years this year at about 470 head count. And Washington has had declining enrollment. Well, when I just talked about the growth we have in our district to the north and the west, there's not a whole lot of development happening out on the east side. So all of our boundaries, attendance centers, are landlocked. And so Washington's current boundaries, because there's not a whole lot of development and growth, there's been some decline in enrollment. Currently, about 1,400 to 1,500 students. So when we look at the difference between a 1,900 building and a 1,400 to 1,500 building, that has impacted us significantly as a district, so much so that Washington High School had to be redistrict for competition purposes a couple of years ago. So they actually compete in football with other schools that Jefferson and Kennedy do not compete with. So that has, when we think about equity across our system and resources, that would be a desire, is to consider how can we have those equitable populations head counts in each one of our high schools as the end of our system in the K-12 system. So that means that Washington would have two places to stretch. They could go north or they could go west if we looked at those boundaries. So one consideration we have is that the Wilson site, Wilson is our smallest historic building, but it has a great amount of land. And so would there be a possibility for an addition onto the Wilson building with a deep renovation of that historic building? Wilson's land could also fit a new build. However, some of the initial feedback we have is the desire to maintain those old historic buildings, which means that you do your very best to make them still beautiful there on the outside, and then make them even more beautiful on the inside with modernized learning settings. So that would fit about 600 students. And then Franklin would also be considered for a renovation and addition. We've invested quite a bit in Franklin, just did a window project with them that was about $2 million. And Franklin is our largest size middle school in regards to square footage of those 4 historic high schools. And we would look to do a renovation and addition there. They would have the space for that to also fit 600 students. So you can see that between those 2 buildings, that could be a 1,200 head count population. Taft would then be a west side renovation and addition. This would probably be a 2-step process. Initially, we would do a renovation in some larger areas. Certainly the gym area and multi-purpose space needs some attention. And then secondly, down the road, probably in that 7 to 8 years out, we would have to then consider a new build at the Taft space. So those new spaces that have been renovated, we would maintain and design for keeping them part of a future build. And then we would eventually have a new building right there on the Taft site. Also probably a 1,200 building. But if you think about the direct feeders then, this would be a mind shift, of course, for our district. And talking to somebody who was a Wilson Ram here, our north side building would be the direct feeder to Kennedy. Wilson and Franklin would then be east and south side feeders to Washington. McKinley, we would keep in our inventory and repurpose for the future. We see great opportunity with our high school innovative magnet program coming down the road, that McKinley could be a great site for that in the future potentially. And that would be, of course, down the road when we've done some of this initial work. But keeping McKinley in our inventory, especially with its historic context, and it's right there downtown and in the MedCore. And then Harding would be repurposed. We'd work with our community to find the best purpose for that space. It's right there next to Knowledge Park. So I imagine we might have some other entities that would be interested in that space at Harding. Roosevelt would maintain as a middle school initially, and then eventually would be repurposed, potentially not of Cedar Rapids Community School District repurpose, but it would be a repurpose with the community that we would work with. I do see some questions in the chat. So Wilson, the question about Wilson would be completely reboundaried, just as all of our middle schools would. In order to draw attention to the need for equitable enrollment across our 3 high schools, probably means that Washington's boundary is going to have to come a little bit to the west and a little bit to the north. Kennedy's boundary would probably shrink a little bit, and Jefferson would also go a little bit to the north. So it's kind of, think about it as like a dial. And so I would imagine right now the east side boundary is at the river. We might need to stretch it a little bit more over towards the Checktown area. I would imagine things that are still west of 380 would still be Jefferson boundary. It would be the things that are closest to downtown that are currently considered Wilson attendance center area, that would be reboundaried. So Wilson would be completely reboundaried, and McKinley would no longer serve as a middle school, but rather a future site for an innovative program at the secondary setting. The benefit, what's the benefit of direct feeder schools? That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. So in the current state, I'll just use Roosevelt as an example. Roosevelt goes to both, the students may go to Kennedy or they may go to Jefferson High School. Kids start establishing those relationships, and they start establishing in the secondary setting, their passions, and they really get rooted, hopefully, into those passion areas. And so by the time they're in 8th grade, they hopefully have some identification of what they want to pursue in their interest areas in high school. Yet their friends may be going in a completely direction than they are. So when you have students who might be going from Roosevelt, some to Jefferson, some to Kennedy. You might be the only one in your friendship group going to Kennedy, and all your other friends are going to Jefferson. So there's the social emotional support side of our students, but also from a design perspective, it allows for clear transitions and planning between the schools. So if you know that you're a Jefferson feeder, then that means we can really design for that feeder program. And both from a resource point of view, a cultural point of view, as well as really supporting students and staff and family point of view. So right now, Kennedy's challenge is they have no direct feeders, and Jefferson has one, and Washington has one. And so that means that there's just a lot more planning around transition, which certainly has worked for us, but the direct feeder program could better support those transition plans and also resources across the district. Great questions too about staffing. So this is the interesting thing. About 10 years ago at the middle school level, especially, and for quite some time, Cedar Rapids was dedicated to what we call the middle school teaming process. However, due to significant budget cuts and funding implications from the state, there had to be some significant cuts, and usually cuts come with the most expensive thing that we have, and that is our staffing. And so we went more from the teaming process to the middle school, kind of more of like a junior high schedule. And so which is just a little less time for teachers to collaborate. And so Friday afternoon early outs have certainly helped relieve some of that collaboration, but the middle school level, having been a middle school principal, it is just a delicate time for kids and adolescents. And so if we could get back to that teaming process, I imagine although we'd have a reduction in sizes of the number of schools, we would have a better and easier time to staff, because we would be able to consolidate staff in from 6 schools to 4 schools. The cost efficiency probably wouldn't be with certified staff, teachers, counselors, whatnot, but rather with some support roles. So for example, you only have 1 cafeteria instead of 2 cafeterias. You only have 1 office instead of 2 offices. And so we're large enough where we would be able to place some of our support staff members in other roles, but it would definitely be helpful on our teaching. We would be able to better staff for teaching with more flexibility and more support for our kids. And there's another question in the chat. So the question is, how would you pay for step 2 of Taft? We would probably have to do a second ask to the community about 7 or 8 years out, unless there would be repurposing, or we would get different feedback from this group on making that a greater priority. And then we do meet, like current state, we meet code for the buildings and the time in which they were built. The new ADA requirements, when you build new, that we'd have to meet those ADA requirements when you build new facilities. And the improvements needed, and so when we're looking at improvements of existing buildings, we definitely use what we call our Pebble funds for those ongoing improvements to our other buildings. When we get to the buckets of finance, I'll make sure I highlight that one, Mr. Lund. Thank you for those questions. Okay, John, let's go ahead and head to our next slide. So from a high school point of view, then that's the middle school concentration. From a high school point of view, the idea of the district aquatic center, as I touched on earlier, would be that the centralized location, it would allow for not just a competition pool, it would also have a practice pool, and it would also have a diving well. Currently, our current pools, as great as they are and accessible within our high schools, they do need attention and they do need renovation. In their current state, if we renovated them, they would be limited to the number of lanes that they have. So there wouldn't be an increase of competition opportunity there. And they maintain as both our practice pool and our competition pool. And then diving also uses that same space. And so choreographing practices is always interesting, but works out in each one of those facilities. As we looked at the possibility of drawing a centralized aquatic center, it would, even if we renovated each of the 3 spaces in the high school, which it would cost probably about 6 to 7 million just for a general renovation. If we were looking to change the number of lanes or the pool experience, that'd be more like 9 to 10 million per pool. But what neither of those things would do is change the spectator experience. We wouldn't be able to increase the space. We would still be limited with the kinds of events that we could host. Pretty much we host dual meets. We aren't able to host much more than that. And so a new aquatic center could actually give us opportunity to host larger events and then even propose some economic development. It would also be less expensive than the renovation of the other 3 pools. So therefore, if we didn't renovate the 3 existing pools, we would change the purpose of those spaces. They're large spaces, potential 2-story spaces that would become more multi-purpose areas, which the high schools have been really asking for a long time, is more opportunities for teams like our dance teams, cheerleading, even yoga practices and stretching practices that happen with wrestling and other programs, as well as it could be additional academic space with classrooms. So that each high school would have its opportunity to redesign those spaces. And then we would also be looking to prioritize practice turf fields at each one of our buildings. We're very limited. The only turf we have is at Kingston Stadium. And our current fields, if there is any sort of weather, we are limited with how we can use those practice fields. So there are times in which in a marching band season, our marching bands don't get access because football's had to use it for practice. Kennedy, we fight for space. We're still looking for space for soccer practice. We just don't have enough space. And those fields are really hard to upkeep. If we had turf, it's much easier to upkeep. It also reduces injury. It also provides greater access for multi-programs because it's easier to maintain field turf. And then Kennedy's in desperate need of high school cafeteria expansion and kitchen renovation. That was able to happen at both Jefferson and Washington during some HVAC upgrades a few years ago. And so Kennedy would certainly benefit from that. And then finally, Metro High School is looking for, that was formerly an elementary decades ago, and they still have an elementary sized gym. They would like a high school sized gym with locker rooms and a locker room addition. And then as they have their own athletic and competition programs, as well as PE. So a few more questions in the chat that I'm going to come back to. Let me see here. Yeah, I did answer the question about restructuring around how that impacts staff. So that again would give us greater opportunity to serve students at the middle school level if we were able to maintain especially the number of certified staff that we have with fewer buildings. And then, the second part of that question, will there be a tentative release of how the boundaries could possibly redesign before the community votes? I think that we could have some general ideas. We would have to have specific head count, but I think we could definitely give some general ideas as we move further down the road, or if the bond, of course, certainly passes, we would have to obviously get more specific, but I do think that we can be more specific with those boundary shares. So thank you for that suggestion. And then the percentage of students from Harding that actually attend other high schools in Kennedy. Harding goes to both Kennedy and Wash. And by enrollment, I could look up that data. I think that with a few kids on that side of town, our biggest open enrollment out on that side of town is actually at the elementary level, and that's from Nixon Elementary to Linmar. But if you think about it, a vertical system, the Nixon Elementary kids eventually become Harding kids. And so that would be our largest open enrollment out for that particular part of town. Our data tells us that the largest open enrollment out that we have is to Miriam's homeschool program. But we could get the current head count of how many of our kids are actually enrolled somewhere else in that Harding boundary. And there could be potential community use, absolutely, with the aquatic center, especially if you want to think about that from an economic development point of view. And I also know the city's having deep conversations about the repurposing of a Bender pool, and making it a multi-generational space in place too. So I think that the city and our school district could have great collaborative conversations around swimming programs for all community members and generations within our community. The redistricting, so the attendance center would likely, we could again be more specific before the vote would actually come. But also we would want to make sure that we are revisiting that population. We of course did the population study while we were developing these concepts. We would want to revisit that population study again and make sure that we are really clear on projected enrollment and head count, and then do our very best to boundary to draw some boundaries there, which would start with the high school boundaries first. Oh, that was a great question about the swimming teams. So when we started this conversation, all three of our athletic directors and principals were on the task force, and they took back this question to their swimming teams, and they're brilliant in regards to scheduling. They already figured out a potential schedule, and including our middle school programming as well. We currently do not have high school PE swimming classes. It's no longer a graduation requirement. It's used mostly for our extracurricular program. The new boundaries would not take effect. It would be a gradual process, not until we actually have implemented the facility master plan. So it would have to be scaffolded over time. Probably the first build would be to the north. And thank you, John, for pulling up this map. So let me use this map to kind of guide the conversation. Somewhere up here in this Hiawatha area, we would have a new site built, and that would have to come first, because when you're doing renovation projects, you got to have a place to put the kids. So a new building would allow us to move students out of Harding into this new building. However, we probably wouldn't reboundary that whole north side until we have another renovation project completed, so that we could start scaffolding where our students are going. And so it would take us several years to get there. That would be a next step plan, and we would have to have a very specific timeline. This particular building would not open. The projection would be probably fall of 26. So the earliest in which that we would have new boundaries would be that fall of 26. That's a great question. So if you look here, this would be potential somewhere up here in the Hiawatha area would be this new building site. Franklin and Wilson would be the feeders to Washington High School. Right in here's the current McKinley, and we would repurpose McKinley, maintaining it in our inventory as a potential innovative high school magnet program. And then, of course, here you can see where Metro High School is located. On the west side over here, Taft would eventually be that new building feeding to Jefferson. Roosevelt is right over here, and Roosevelt would also be a direct feeder to Jefferson until we did the second step process of Taft, and then Roosevelt would then be repurposed with our community. Thank you, John. So then cost, like what does all this look like? These are the cost estimates and of what potentially this could look like as a district. And so you can see the estimated construction cost is $260 million, but other costs being permits and design fees and city requirements and just other, about a 20% allowance there, which then gets to a projected cost of $312 million. Just to put in this perspective, Central Iowa, a couple of districts have built new high schools in Central Iowa, and those high schools came out to the price tag of 135 million, serving about the size of Jefferson, about 1,600 students, and I think they can go up to about 1,800 students in both those high schools. So brand new high school costing 135 million for 312 million. We're looking to improve every single secondary building, and also help forecast our district for decades to come, instead of waiting and wondering if we have enrollment decline or population trends that we need to pay attention to, responding and just closing buildings, or actually struggling with keeping up with our old aging buildings as well. And so this is a big ask, but it would hopefully serve us for a very long time. And I know there's something in the chat too. I'll bring that question back up. This is just a slide that reviews the buckets of school finance. I'm not going to do a deep dive here. And John, feel free to unmic yourself and jump in at any time. But we live in buckets of funding, and we get certain revenue sources, and we have certain expenditures, and there's rules with every bucket. So not every bucket can pay for the same thing. The biggest bucket that we have is called the general fund. And our biggest cost out of general fund, 90% of it is on people. So this is what pays for salaries and benefits, services, etc., for our kids. The most important thing, right, are the people that we have serving our children. And so that is the biggest bucket. And of course, the biggest expense is for our kids. So just from a facility point of view, we have the Capital Projects Fund, also known as SAVE, with the original facility master plan that I discussed earlier with our elementary schools. This is how we are funding our elementary schools, is through the SAVE project. And then the Pebble Fund is also a fund that we use that comes from property taxes. And this is something that we use for facilities as well. And that's really for building improvements. So things like the new entryways we've had in the high schools, some new bathrooms that we've had across the district, but we need a new roof. Other things, John, that you would want to put into the Pebble Fund bucket that folks might.
It's really any of the projects that we do to keep our buildings in the shape that they're in. So asphalt, masonry, tuck pointing work, concrete work, roofing work. You touched on the restrooms, some of the security improvements at our middle schools and high schools. All of that is funded through the Pebble Fund currently.
So just as we think about buckets of money here, those are the two current funding streams for facilities. We have no debt right now. So we did have the last bond issue that we had as a district was for Viola Gibson. That debt has been paid off. So we have no bond debt at the moment. And so then how do you fund a big project like this for all these secondary buildings? It would have to be through what's called debt service or a GO bond. And so that is when the voters are asked to vote on a project. And then there's a projected timeline of what that cost would be for our taxpayers. And so we'll share what that would look like. I think there's some questions in the chat here. So before we go to the next slide, let's take a look. All right. There is a question to get the access to all of the data that we used as a task force. And then what were the assessments that were used for the building assessments. Susan and or Joe, I would ask that if you can answer those questions about the things that were used to assess our buildings in regards to environmental impact, carbon emissions, etc.
So part of our facility assessment directly isn't necessarily include all aspects of environmental impacts. Only because when we're doing facility assessments, it's a point in time in terms of the condition of the building. It does not involve demolition or new construction in terms of what those materials are and how those would be handled, because we don't know that at that time. So that a lot of our environmental impact and assessment in terms of happens once the plan is determined. So like Noreen said, we didn't assume any of the buildings are going to be demolished at this point in time. We don't assume new construction in terms of what those materials are. So the sustainable piece comes in, the environmental impacts comes once we get into design. It's not something that we can answer all those questions when we're doing facility assessments.
So Susan, when we look at like a map of one of our schools and where we had the red and the yellow and the green zones, it's a matter of looking at what currently needed to be addressed in regards to ADA accessibility. And yes, absolutely what needed facility attention that would need to be brought up to be a modernized facility. And so it wasn't assumed that that building would be demolished and therefore would need different types of attention. Rather, what's the assessment process to bring that building to a modernized capacity?
So one of the questions that just got added was, how do we arrive at estimates? So the estimates represent the condition of the facility at that point in time. It's a piece of data. It's a single piece of data. So when we assess a building, let's just say, for example, there are no ADA restrooms compliant in the building, we can put a cost of what it would take to build an ADA restroom. It's not a design solution. It's not a design exercise at this point. It's a representation of that deficiency, and we can put a price tag to it. So the facility assessments are really just representing a piece of data at one point in time. And so it's an information that helps that task force be able to think through ideas and understand a little more about the current condition of the district.
Thank you, Susan. One other question here is the step one of TAF renovation would include a large, more multi-purpose space. So a gym, of course, would be needed, necessary in that renovation, and some of the other larger spaces and places that would need to be renovated. There would not be a deep dive of renovating a ton of the academic space, knowing that in step two, we would be really looking at a new build. So that those larger spaces then would be maintained and designed for a future build.
And Noreen, I can add on that a little bit too.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Secure main entrance would be added at Taft. There would be some ADA and code updates throughout the building. We'd have an additional parking and fire lane that would get us back to get our fire trucks in the proximity that it needs to that building, which it can't right now. It'd get us access to some of the extracurricular space that is on the north side of the building. We would do some repairs to the tennis courts, and we would update the track as well.
And the question is, why the gym at this time? Well, projection for a larger school, we know that we would need to increase the size of the gym, but also the current state of the gym, yes, it's functional, but also it has limitations in regards to competition space. Okay. So when you're looking at $312 million, what does that mean to the taxpayer? And so up here at the top of the slide, you can see 312 million would stretch sales out to keep to a $2.70 tax rate, which means that $2.70 per $1,000 valuation of a home would be the cost or the tax rate increase. So for example, a home that's $250,000, if you add $2.70 per 1,000, that would be an annual cost of $350 to that house, $352.28 actually, which is an estimate of about $29.36 per month, $29.36 per month on that particular household. So when we look at our history of our tax rate levy, most recently in fiscal year 2022, our tax rate levy was $15.36. because we didn't have to be on the budget guarantee, and I won't get into the details of what that means in school finance, but we were through our finance process and budgeting process with school finance, able to capture 60 cents per $1,000 residential home, or per $1,000 tax valuation. We were able to give 60 cents back to our taxpayers. So instead of looking at other means, we wanted to make sure that that money went back to our taxpayers. So that reduced actually our tax school levy from 1536 to FY23. We went down to 1471. So over time, then what does that look like for Cedar Rapids? So if you look at this bar graph, you can see in fiscal year 2014, tax levy rate was $15.48 per $1,000 valuation of Cedar Rapids. And this past year, it's 1536 for fiscal year 23 here, it's $14.71. So we've had a downward trend and have tried to be fiscally responsible to the taxpayers in our district. See if there's a question here. I'll come back to that question, Devin, in regards to for the architects. We'll close up our school finance question, then we'll circle back on that. So in regards to then, what does this look like in comparison to other districts? Last year, this is 2022 fiscal year, Cedar Rapids was at 1536. And so you can see what we compare to other districts. So Center Point Urbana, 1799, Central City, 1760. We get compared to College Community and Linn-Mar quite a bit. 1661 is College Community, 1787 is Linn-Mar, 1787 is Lisbon, Marion's at $18, Mount Vernon's at $17.89, etc. So we are certainly below most other districts when it comes to property tax levy comparisons. And so this year we're at 1471, which would put us significantly lower than everybody else, except North Lynn, who's at 1343. Oh, you know what, John, go back to that slide one more time. Sorry about that. If we then consider, what then does that look like if we were to consider an increase in property taxes for this particular ask? We would jump from 1471, which is over here in the yellow box, to 1741, which would still put us below Center Point Urbana, Central City. College Communities went up this past year because I know they have a bond issue. I just don't know what their FY23 is at this point in time, but still below Linn-Mar, still below Lisbon, still below Marion, still below Mount Vernon. And so definitely it would be a bump. And that would be over probably a 20 to 24 year time period, depending on how we issue the bonds. And if you'll go to the next slide, please, John. So really, this was the themes that we discussed as a task force: is opportunity and access, not just opportunity for our kids. I love the question about an auditorium, the pool. Could that be for community use? Absolutely. We want to do things that are going to help our community and our city, as well as the future projections of the economic development of our town. Our buildings do need attention. Our kids deserve the very best of the best in regards to facilities. However, we do understand the current context. And we do know that if we don't address things now, that they're going to have to be addressed later. And if we do a series of small asks, it could take us up to 50 to 60 years to get there. And we are hoping to accelerate that within a 10-year time period for the duration of 50, 60 years in front of us. So let me see, there's some more questions in the chat here. A question about Wilson. We're looking at a renovation and an addition at Wilson, and not a demolition, unless we'll probably have a study group around that project. And unless there would be a greater need, or we find out that a deeper dive into Wilson says, boy, you got a lot more going on in this building and it needs more help than we thought. We would really like to consider a renovation and an addition there. Wilson has some land opportunity, and on the south side of that building could potentially have an addition, but and also the parking lot to the east side of the building. So we would at least like to start there and consider what the possibilities of a renovation project would be at Wilson. So the next question is about SAVE funding. And how much do we anticipate the district will have received from SAVE funding between 2009 and 2050? That vote has been approved to continue the allocations for SAVE. And so right now, when we are looking at our elementary projects, those costs have been, let's just say, about 20 million per project. And that has come about every 2 years. John, do you want to jump on any more about SAVE funding between now and 2050?
No, I mean, I think you covered it there. To get those direct numbers for that, I would have to look that up. That's not something that I know off the top of my head.
We do know that that bucket is able to afford those projects as we project them into the future, but we can't do $20 million every year. It's more like every other year or every third year. And so that's how we want to make sure that we continue to keep our eyes on that particular bucket of money. And yes, it is till 2050. And we are now onto our third project with the elementary plan. And so we project about 15 more years of work there with the elementary schools. Thanks for the answer there, Susan, in the chat in regards to the architect question. Oh, does the district need to go to the community for a new Pebble rate in 2 years? That will be coming up in regards to Pebble is a voter determination. Yes. And the question is, will that decision come out before the vote? I'm not sure which decision we're talking about there. We're talking about the tax evaluation, or maybe you're talking about boundaries as well. We will try and provide as much detailed information to inform our community as possible. This is the beginning of those input sessions. So your feedback is really welcome of things that are going to help and voters make informed decisions. So you bet. Absolutely.
Noreen, I think that question was in regards to whether Wilson would be a renovation or a new build.
Oh, yes. We, so I'm just going to use another project right now. After the next project we have for elementaries is over on the east side. It's Arthur and Garfield consolidation. We'll be building a new elementary in the Arthur Annex site. And so after that, we're going to come back over here to the west side, looking at Madison and Harrison. We're going to do a study on this fall around that particular project, wondering if it's a Harrison renovation in addition, or a new build on the Madison site. But when we look at our data and the current population and enrollment, it's more heavily populated around the Harrison neighborhood. So it does make sense for geography wise to use that particular site, which means that we'll be looking at a renovation there. I think with our historic foundation and other input we've had from the community, so it's really important to hear from our community around Wilson. If it's a desire for our community to make sure that we are making renovation a priority at that site, then that's what we want to be able to do. Thank you for that question. John, can you go to the next slide? I think this is further opportunity for folks to give feedback. Yeah. Your questions have been great in the chat. I would invite in more there if you have any more. We also would invite just your thoughts and feedback in general. There's a QR code here. And then also I think Heather is going to put in the chat a link to a survey. There you can go either direction. You can use the survey link in the chat, or you can scan the QR code with your phone, and that will take you to a feedback survey about these concepts. And they are just concepts, hopefully addressing big ideas and needs for our district for the future. But your time is so valuable, and thank you for spending it with us today, so that we can hopefully give you information, at least where the current state is, and then definitely want to invite your feedback. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your input there. And I can't agree with you more. Our kids do deserve the absolute best, and we want them to have it. And, you know, I get made fun of a little bit by our teammates about having a competitive spirit about our district, but our kids do absolutely deserve it. And when they go visiting other spaces and places, they can see a difference. And they do deserve access to the absolute best, and we want to do our very best to give it to them. So, and we want to be mindful why we do it. Thank you so much, everyone. So we again appreciate your feedback on the form, and we have more sessions to come. Tonight will be a live session at Kennedy High School. We will have another virtual evening event on September 21st, I believe. And then next week we're at Washington High School. And then what we'll do is with the recording of today, we'll post that to our facility master plan website, but also as we're pushing out reminders, it'll be linked right in there to the facility master plan website. So this recorded session will be available for those who could not attend.
Noreen, there was one more question about the redistricting for elementary schools too from Sydney.
Oh, redistricting of so once this is determined, the high school rebounding, then we have to look at middle schools, and then of course we'd have to look at elementary schools as well. There's some automatics that things that can be assumed. So for example, I'll just use West Willow as an example. West Willow is a feeder to Jefferson. It's a West Side school. I'm going to assume that West Willow will continue to be a feeder to Jefferson. So there's definitely some schools that will be as a new build that would maintain. We would have to go through that scaffolding. And so when we look at Kennedy's Attendance Center, Washington's Attendance Center, and Jefferson's Attendance Center, then we would definitely have to look at the new middle school boundaries and the elementary boundaries as well. Stretching out the sales meeting. And then Todd, your question about would the levy go longer than 20 years? If depending on the scaffold of the projects, if the first project was, let's say, that new build of a middle school to the north, we would not issue all $312 million all at once, probably over a several year time period, which means that this could go maybe about 24 years. We can, depending on how we chose to issue those bonds. Or we could say nope all at once, and it would be a 20-year projection. So we'll get some more detailed information with our analysts about that, and be able to issue that for our taxpayers as well.
Noreen,
how much?
Question
Yeah, I see. How much time average would students spend on a bus before and after school for the students? So currently we have students, as you well know, we bus our students. And so that would be part of the redistricting too, is considering those distances. So I'll just use the Washington territory as an example. We would have 2 middle schools feeding to Wash, Franklin and potentially the Wilson territory. So that would have to be part of the consideration, is when we're looking at not just head count, but also distance, how much time kids are spending on the bus area. So let's just say the farthest point is Franklin, and then to the farthest point being Wilson, and in the middle really is the McKinley area. Well, it's not that far to get from that point A to that point B. So within our district, that would not, I think, be as challenging to address at the middle school level because of the geography. I do understand your question in regards to our high school boundaries. And so we already consider that. Kennedy's got a large scope of space, especially when you go furthest out to Palo. And so we already have students who ride the bus for about a half an hour in the morning and afternoon to get home. And so that is important to consider when we're looking at busing. So we'd have to consider that as we look at those boundaries.
John, to answer your question about where this, the replay of this presentation would be, we'll have this posted underneath of our facility master plan webpage on our website.
And students would still continue to be able to participate in after school activities. Absolutely. We want them to be participating in after school activities. Mr. Lund, your question about projections for revenue. We work with the specialists on bond issues. So this is their business. This is what they do. They do it really, really well. And so we would make sure that that information is accurate. Okay. Thank you so much again for all your participation and questions. Oh, and the last, Todd, your question about Taft, why would we include it now? It would cost probably to build a second new middle school site would be a projected another 60 million. We just can't afford to do it all. As much as we want to be able to do it all, we just can't afford to do it all. And so and I think also it would give us an opportunity to learn from these initial first steps. And so that's why we've considered making it a two-step process. Also, Taft's in pretty good shape in the current state. And so some additions and renovations initially would help us. And then Roosevelt has a good, strong enrollment as well. And so those two sites could then continue to feed to Jefferson. And that's why we would make the second ask later on. But yeah, as much as I would love to be able to ask for even more, I think asking what we're asking is quite a bit. And that could keep us at that $2.70 tax levy rate. If we go above that, we'd have to have a two question vote on the ballot, which means do we have permission to ask more than 270, which would be a big ask to the community. It's already a big ask, very much recognize that. So the future ask might be, Todd, I would imagine it could be, John, you and I just talked about this morning for the step 2 of the Taft project. John?
Yes.
The step 2 of the TAP project, the ask could be probably 7 or 8 years out.
Yeah, it'd probably more towards that 10-year timeline. Really, that would be the 312.5 million, and the projects involved with that would be done prior to the second for the Taft renovation.
And so currently, so the new building on the north side is the estimated cost is 60 million, correct?
Somewhere in that ballpark. We haven't really done that full study.
Yeah.
But based on the that we have to the north, it would be around there.
Yeah. So, Mr. Lund, it would depend on, of course, what costs are at that time, 10 years out from now, of the step 2 of the Taft project. But I estimate for a new middle school of that size, we would be right in there, probably around the initial step 1. We would maintain those new parts of the facility. So that cost would already be absorbed. So I bet you we'd be in the ask of about 50 to 60 million for a new school there on that site. Okay. Yeah, it would be a second ask, Todd. Correct. And yes, we would still be paying for the original ask, because that would probably be 20 years. The new middle school, Jen, if we built the new to the north and did that first, probably the soonest in which we could open that would be the fall of 26. And then the renovation projects would happen thereafter. Very good question. Great questions. I'm afraid to hang up because we have folks still asking questions. So. Okay, I think that wraps it up. Heather, thank you so much for recording. You can press stop recording now.